There's a huge number of engineers, there's huge development, so it's probably like the biggest engineering market, but it's its own thing. It's its own bubble, right? And the technology that picks up inside that bubble are things that have been translated to Chinese. So if you want to be successful with a new piece of technology, you could just make sure that you have a Chinese documentation and teach it to people here, and it would become the thing. They don't have access to all the resources we get in the rest of the world because of their Great Firewall. And so there's no like content sharing and from the outside to China. So they have their own, everything is duplicated, right, and copied or recreated inside that Chinese bubble. So it's a Chinese internet, right? So it's an intranet, it's a big intranet. So there's a large set of these developers that have all the documentation in Chinese and all the communities, and they have WeChat groups where they have a whole bunch of people and they help each other.
To be honest, the environment of China is not so open, so we're trying to use a more technical way to build a more open and more like utopian environment and group. They're trying to solve the problems that maybe you can't rely on from government or from other departments to help them. They try to help themselves.
Imagine if the internet took hold in China. Imagine how freedom would spread.
Unrestricted internet access is a source of strength.
Most people, especially foreigners, they would think that the language is the biggest barrier. It's not a biggest problem no longer. You can see from the GitHub that every famous framework software, in their documentation, there's a Chinese version. The most biggest barrier, I would say, is the meaning of open source and the meaning of free software, the free. I still think that's because of the culture of China. Even nowadays, or in the past few years, people in China, they get benefits from open source or free software. So they will simply think it's free, oh, I like it. And everybody help to improve it, and I can use it for free. Even I can some kind of steal it and say, hey, this is my work.
Programmers are kind of like artists, but the difference between programmer and painter or musician is the art that programmers created. Whereas a programmer, the things you created, it's inherently interactive. And I love that. And I love that. I love people playing with the stuff I created and giving me feedback, and I'd be able to modify it and release changes to them as I see need. Today, if you start any startup, you're going to use a lot of open source softwares. It's impossible to build everything from scratch, and it doesn't make sense, right? And it's a lot of great work that other people have built already. So the first time I use open source is really like I'm a beneficiary of it. And the more I use it, I start, basically believe that I need to give back to the community. The cloud computing conference, it's actually I think community is so important.
I mean, if you look in Europe, the US, it's not just about individual communities. I think there's now a global movement, and so there's a lot of pollination in between different projects and different communities. In some sense, I find it just as improbable as Wikipedia, in the sense that nobody would in their right mind think that if you put something out there and you let anybody go and contribute to it, and it's totally open and it's kind of a hippie commune, that it would just yield the best result. But somehow it does, and it does say something about the community overall of engineers and contributors. In the case of Wikipedia, there are a lot of people willing to do the right thing and invest a ton of effort and hours into this.
It's very, very different from many other industries or many other areas where people need to pay stuff, and I think that's quite unique to this industry, to the open source community. The Chinese community is probably unique in every direction. An open source community is an example of it.
I'm aware of the general situation of the Chinese developers. You'll be surprised how many of them actually are sort of reluctant to read English content. It's funny because sometimes you would be even accused of being elitist when you say like you should just really learn English if you want to be a good programmer. Some people will be like, why? Like, I can just be good at programming. I don't want to learn English. But then you realize like a lot of these latest stuff, they come out in English first. If you always rely on someone else to translate for you, you'll be put at a disadvantage.
Everything we want to learn, we translate to Chinese. Although many of us can read Chinese, read in English, but we still need the Chinese to educate more people, more developers. And I think this makes a difference. Maybe our network is a bit slow to connect to GitHub, and we have the delay of time when the documents spread in the Chinese community. And many times I see new technologies published by Facebook, by Google, and by Microsoft. They are spreading on Twitter, and I see, and some of us just see that on Twitter, but we have to introduce them to Chinese people on Weibo, on Zhihu, and social medias.
I mean, it's still China, still the focus on making a living, and because there's a lot of financial burden that the Chinese face, so they are really focused on things that bring in money, while open source is often like out of a sense of passion or wanting to have something outside of the corporate control, or so these are not really things that are necessarily very profitable in the short term, right? So it's a long-term investment typically.
Chinese in internet industry love to do this 996 working schedules. Most of the developers, they're really busy at their work, so sometimes they really want to do something outside of their work, but they don't really have time.
Because the concentration of people who are involved in open source in China is not so high, and they felt like the people who can get involved with open source are not them, are different, are people who are way better, are way superior. And so I think combining that with the language barrier, you feel like it's not going to be you who's doing the contribution. They didn't realize that the people who are working on open source are basically just your neighbor, right? Your next door guy. I want to lower the barrier for people to feel comfortable, start contributing, even if it's a small change. When you start doing that, you'll feel like, oh, it's not that difficult. Actually, it was an enlightenment moment for myself as well when I did it the first time, when I contributed to an open source project, and I felt like, and people accepted the pull request. You feel like you're part of something, and you feel like you could do it.
I really encourage Chinese developers to learn to improve their English skills. And we can always do things in Chinese, but if we want to get more information, so we have to use some internationalized language like English, I think. Yeah.
As Chinese developers become more proficient in English, become more, like the barrier of getting involved become lower, and especially their perceived barrier become lower, we'll see a lot more Chinese developers contributing to the open source community in general.
I'm hoping that we can bring more flexibility and freedom, and at the same time kind of financial reward, right, to people, so that having financial independence, they can now look at contributing to open source project, to their community, to non-profit project, to personal projects.
Open source culture is well accepted in foreign countries, but in China, there's not really a community or not really an environment to form this to form this culture. I still think there's a long way to go. And we are on our way to make it, to host more events or conference, to tell people what's open source about, what's free software about.
Thousands of developers find jobs across Europe using Honeypot. If you're up for a new challenge in one of these European cities, sign up at honeypot.io. If you want to see more tech documentaries, then subscribe so you don't miss the next one.